Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. What I want to discuss today is the difference between early Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism, in particular as expressed in a recent essay by the monastic scholar Bhikkhu Sujato. Now, as a background, oftentimes when we read or hear about early Buddhism nowadays, especially within a scholarly context, oftentimes the discussion, or even frankly in an ordinary everyday context, the discussion tends to go back and forth between early Buddhism and Theravada. They tend to sort of run together. And this is understandable because of all of the present-day schools of Buddhism. It's Theravada that reveres the most some of the texts which express the philosophy and ideas and practices we find in early Buddhism. That is, the practices and the rest, the philosophy, found in the Pali Canon. Now, to be fair, this same material exists in other copies, other recensions, other versions, we might say, in Chinese, in Sanskrit, and other Indic languages, fragmentary anyhow, even fragments in Tibetan. So the Pali Canon isn't the only place to find early Buddhism. Indeed, the best way that scholars know to find early Buddhism is to do comparative studies of all of these texts with the Pali texts to find what seems the most credible kind of historical reconstruction that we can make. Now, all that is to say that these are controversial matters. The distinction even between early Buddhism and Theravada is itself controversial. It involves a lot of deep scholarly research, and different people will come to different answers. It's also controversial because the Theravada school itself, many practitioners of Theravada believe they are the repository of that early teaching as unchanged from the way the Buddha himself taught it. So the very idea that there's a distinction to be made between early Buddhism on the one hand and Theravada on the other is going to be controversial, and indeed is going to rub a lot of people the wrong way. In order to make this distinction well, you have to have a deep knowledge both of these early texts in their various recensions and their various versions, as well as a deep understanding of the Theravada belief and practice in order to know the difference precisely. Now, I've discussed a lot of these kinds of points in past videos of mine, and I will be leaving links to some of those videos down below in the notes in case you want to know more. But when I do the material for my videos, I rely upon experts of both of these in order to help me to know the differences. And one of these experts, indeed, is Bhikkhu Sujato himself, who, as well as being a Theravada monastic, in other words, he's somebody within the Theravada school of practice, is also a scholar of the early tradition, and indeed a translator of the early texts. And he's somebody who, at least I have seen at times, has described himself as somebody who is a follower of early Buddhism rather than a follower of Theravada. In other words, he sees himself more allied to that early tradition than to the practices of contemporary Theravada in general. Now, as I say, he's written a paper where he makes some distinctions between early Buddhism and Theravada, places where there are differences. I recall asking him a while back on the Sutta Central Forum, which is where he sort of resides, at least on the internet, asking him for such a thing several years ago, and him basically saying no way. And the reason that I thought he probably said that was because it is controversial. When you say, not only that there is a difference here between Theravada and early Buddhism, but when you give examples, you're going to open yourself up to some controversy. So in any event, what I want to do today is to go through a few of these, a few of the things that he notes. I can't go through the whole thing, it's long. I'll leave a link to it also down below in the notes in case you want to read all of what he has to say. Although it's lengthy and he goes through a number of different subjects that he thinks illustrate differences between the Theravada and early Buddhism. Each of those subjects is treated relatively shortly, so there's not a lot of information in any particular subject, and really you'll have to go elsewhere to find a lot of the information about them. But as I say, I've done videos on them, so you can learn more in the videos. Also, many of the distinctions he makes are somewhat fine distinctions, somewhat perhaps even obscure distinctions to some of us, that may not involve something that really has to do with our practice so much. So if some of these distinctions go over your head, I wouldn't worry about it. But in any event, here are 6 that I picked out as particularly interesting. The first of these distinctions has to do with the authorship of the abhidhamma. Now, what is the abhidhamma? The abhidhamma are a set of texts that essentially compile all of the Buddhist Dharma into a strictly ordered set of beliefs, assertions, a very well cataloged sort of a system of philosophy. Now, why is that important? Well, because when we look at the suttas, that is to say the Buddhist dialogues and discourses, if we want to find out about a particular subject, we're going to have a hard time finding it because the Buddha discusses it here and there and another place, and it's all over the place. It's difficult to find all you want to know about a particular subject. So at some point, this is at least what historians believe, at some point after the Buddha's lifetime, scholar monks came together and tried to essentially refine and catalog and categorize all of the Buddhist Dharma as they saw it into a form that was easier to digest and easier to understand. It was somewhat drier because it was not in the form of dialogues and discussions, which are richer and more fun to sort of read and understand. Instead, it was very dry, lists and so on. That, however, is the abhidharma. Now, within the Theravada is the idea that the Buddha himself constructed the abhidharma and taught it to other people. However, scholars believe that this is not true, and that in fact the abhidharma came at a period after the Buddha's lifetime. So this indeed is the first distinction I'm going to discuss, is a difference between what we find in the Theravada and in early Buddhism. Early Buddhism did not have an abhidharma, the Theravada does. Therefore also, the abhidharma is not a good source for beliefs about early Buddhism. That is to say, if we look to what was believed by people in the early Sangha, perhaps the time of the Buddha's life, the abhidharma is not going to tell us that, because the abhidharma came later. The second point I want to discuss that he brings up, that Bhikkhu Sujato brings up, is one of linguistic essentialism. That is, it's often claimed within the Theravada that there's something particularly special about the Pali language. This is the language in which the Buddha's discourses are preserved within the Theravada tradition. It's sometimes believed, indeed, Buddhaghosa himself said, Buddhaghosa is a 5th century scholar and monastic, perhaps the greatest scholar monastic within the Theravada tradition. Buddhaghosa even said that the Pali language is sort of an original language. That is to say, if you brought somebody up without learning any language, they would start speaking Pali, which is pretty clearly not true. But in any event, it's believed within the Theravada that Pali is a very special language and is specially associated, let's say, with Buddhism. However, as Bhikkhu Sujato says, that's not true, and indeed the Buddha himself seems not to have believed anything like that. The Buddha himself is pretty clear that languages are just conventional ways of discussing things, and any language is as good as any other language, and that the Buddha Dharma should be discussed in the local dialect. And indeed, I did a video about that topic a while ago, and I'll leave a link to that video down below in the notes. The third distinction is the distinction of devotion versus meditation in practice. Bhikkhu Sujato notes that in the early tradition, practice was centered around meditation, around personal journeys, in particular of meditation, leading to investigation of one's own mental states, leading to insight, and leading eventually to enlightenment. However, Bhikkhu Sujato notes that as time went on, that picture of practice began to be substituted by a picture involving more devotional practices. So that instead of enlightenment being preceded by practices of meditation, instead enlightenment is preceded by devotional activity. In other words, people are described as having done great acts of devotion in prior lifetimes that led to their enlightenment in this lifetime, rather than being described as having done meditation within this lifetime, leading to enlightenment within this lifetime. These are subtle distinctions, and as Sujato notes, there are elements of both in every tradition. It's not that it's all one or all the other. However, there does seem to be, in the Theravada tradition, more of an emphasis on devotional practices than we find in the early tradition. And indeed, I also did a video on devotion in early Buddhism, which I think illustrates the importance of this distinction. I'll leave a link also to that video down below in the notes. Now, Bhikkhu Sujato's fourth distinction between early Buddhism and Theravada involves what's called dry insight. Dry insight is the idea that we can gain insight, that is to say, we can gain knowledge of the important aspects of reality in a way that leads us to enlightenment without the use of jhana. Now, what is jhana? Jhana, I've done videos about them recently, a number of deep states of meditative absorption, extremely pleasant states, refined, beautiful, pleasant states of mind. And in certain schools of Buddhism within the Theravada, it's believed that we don't need these in order to become enlightened. As Bhikkhu Sujato argues, there is no doctrine of dry insight in the early Buddhist texts. Every formulation of the path includes samadhi, and wherever samadhi is defined in a key doctrinal context, it is always the four jhanas. Now, there's a number of things that Bhikkhu Sujato is talking about here. Samadhi essentially means concentration. A number of different ways to translate it. The standard way to translate it is concentration. It's also the eighth stage in the Eightfold Path. That is to say, the final stage is the stage of right concentration, or right sammasamadhi, right concentration. And it's true that right concentration is most often defined in terms of the achievement of the four jhanas. And so that's how we can standardly understand it. I mean, we can understand them in most of the suttas. However, there are suttas that seem to contradict this possibility. In other words, that present other options, at least on their face, on the surface. Either the option of attaining enlightenment, let's say, with only one jhana, which Bhikkhu Sujato allows as possible, or even attaining enlightenment without, at least explicitly, any jhana. Now, this is a matter of some controversy. And indeed, I did a video about this one as well in the past, and I'll also leave a link to that video down below in the notes. These are issues that involve interpretation. As Bhikkhu Sujato argued, as we just saw, he says that, samadhi is defined as involving the jhanas in key doctrinal contexts. The question is, what do we count as a key doctrinal context? That's a matter of debate. That's a matter of discussion. It's not as though we can simply read off from the text, this is a key text, and this other text, well, that's one that we don't have to believe. At least not on its face. We need arguments. And Bhikkhu Sujato says that he's given arguments in other places for this. The question, though, is whether we actually do need jhana, or at least one jhana, or whether, for example, the Brahmaviharas are sufficient, or whether the formless attainments are sufficient, because there are texts in which only the formless attainments appear, and then enlightenment proceeds from those. There are also texts that claim that we can gain enlightenment after having the Brahma-viharas and then seeing them with insight. Now, we need insight in either case, but the question is whether the jhanas are implied in either of those. It's, again, not something we can read off the texts, because the jhanas themselves are not discussed in these contexts. Bhikkhu Sujato is going to say they're implied. Who knows? This is an example of where it's not so simple to be able to tell what is said in early Buddhism. You can't simply read a text and say, okay, now I know what this implies about the early Buddhist way of thinking. That involves an enormous amount of scholarship, of comparisons, of texts, of interpretation, and so it's a matter of, it's going to continue to be a controversial matter. The fifth difference that Bhikkhu Sujato sees between early Buddhism and the Theravada revolves around the idea of the radiant mind. The radiant mind is expressing either nirvana or some kind of transcendent consciousness that is the aim of our practice. In other words, what we're trying to aim at is to reveal this radiant mind. We're trying to reveal this kind of transcendent consciousness that lies underneath perhaps all of our experience. What Bhikkhu Sujato says is, for the early Buddhist texts, on the other hand, consciousness of any form is suffering, and nirvana, nibbana, is the cessation of suffering. The radiant mind, in similar terms, refer to jhana. And indeed, that's what many scholars believe, is that this expression of the radiance of the mind is an expression describing the pleasure, the kind of pleasure, the kind of deep pleasure, the kind of equanimous pleasure that is a pleasure beyond pleasure, shall we say, that is expressed in the fourth jhana, or at least one of the jhanas. That the Buddha often describes the mind in jhana as radiant, as at least he uses terms that are associated with radiance. And so the point here is that the context in which we read about the radiant mind in the early texts don't make it clear exactly what's being described. And so some practitioners take these to describe enlightenment, whereas other scholars take them not to be describing enlightenment, but rather to be describing these wonderful states of deep meditative absorption. I also did a video on that subject a while back, and I'll leave a link to it as well down below in the notes. The sixth, particularly important difference, I think, that Bhikkhu Sujato talks about in this paper is one involving women in Buddhism, and in particular, the role of the nuns order, the bhikkhunis order within Buddhism. Now, the role of women in Buddhist history and in early Buddhism has never been entirely equal to that of men. It has always been a somewhat subordinate role, and this is a problem for many of us. However, the role of women, at least in the early Sangha, so far as we know, seems to have been a good deal more equal than we find in some contemporary practice, particularly in the Theravada. Indeed, as many of us will know, the nuns' order died out in the Theravada several centuries ago, and some people nowadays are trying to revive that order, and in so doing are coming up against a very strong pushback by a certain number of traditional Theravada believers and practitioners. And this is one way that early Buddhism seems to differ from contemporary Theravada, at least in certain respects. That in early Buddhism, the Buddha made quite clear that women should have a role within the Sangha. Indeed, he said that he wouldn't pass away until there was, a Sangha of male monks and female nuns, and male and female lay followers. So that also is an important difference here. And I also did a video, indeed a number of videos on this whole subject, but one in particular on the nuns' order and this controversy that we find nowadays over people trying to reinstate it by looking back to early Buddhism to try to reform what we find in contemporary Theravada. Now, there's much, much more in Bhikkhu Sujato's paper, the one that I've been using as a source for this video. So again, I suggest, I encourage you to read the paper, because you'll see a number of other different issues. And so far as I know, Bhikkhu Sujato may add more in the future, and there's a whole thread about this over at the Sutta Central website, which you can also go and take a look at. But do keep in mind that all of this material here is controversial. That although Bhikkhu Sujato says these are the distinctions he sees between early Buddhism and Theravada, not every scholar is going to agree with these. So what we should take this as is a sort of a first draft, an attempt by somebody to do a first draft here, and with luck and hopefully over the coming years and decades, other people will attempt to correct or add or subtract from this list and come out with a better list in the future, a more complete list. Because what we need really nowadays is a more deep kind of encounter with early Buddhism by people both within the monastic community of, let's say, Theravada monastics or other monastics from other belief systems within Buddhism, but also we need scholarly study. And unfortunately, the scholarship around early Buddhism has almost completely died out within the academy. It's become completely unfashionable to study early Buddhism academically nowadays, which is a real shame, because I think it's something that we need desperately. It would be really good to have more scholarship around these kinds of topics. And I did an earlier video about this encounter between early Buddhism and the scholarship when I did this video a while back on a video done by Religion for Breakfast, where over at Religion for Breakfast had a discussion about the Buddha, which depended on some of this scholarship and some of the problems that I found with it. So in any event, I'll leave a link to that up on the screen if you want to hear more about that. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and seeing if you want to help support the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much to all of my patrons over on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.